Hello and welcome to KU Pathshala. I am Bhagya Rajeswari and I am a language instructor. Let me confess right at the outset today that the novel I have chosen for discussion is one of my all-time favorites. Hence, I'm going to rave about it. I might even be slightly biased towards the novel when I'll be talking about it. But I guess when I'll disclose the title of the novel with all of you, you will not have it anyway either. Yes, it's this classic from English literature, Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. When Wuthering Heights was published in the year 1847 by Emily Bronte under the pen name Ellis Bell, it was received with extreme criticism. It was called a strange book, a monster book. It was even labeled as tantalizing, terrifying, inartistic, puzzling, vulgar, and even, said to have filled with unnatural horrors. But despite all the backlash, despite all the harsh criticism, nobody could actually ignore the power of this novel. Unfortunately, Emily Bronte did not live long enough to tell us more about the mystic aura surrounding this novel, or the mystery that usually people speak about when it comes to Wuthering Heights. But what astonishes us, what surprises us, is this irrefutable charm and acceptance this novel enjoys almost a century later. And that's exactly why I have chosen this novel for a discussion with all of you. What makes Wuthering Heights so lovable? Why do people love being under its influence? Well, in order to find answers to all these questions, we might have to take a short trip down the memory lane. Maybe we should try and get to know more about the Bronte sisters. Maybe that will help us understand this novel a bit better. The Brontes came to Haworth, which is a village and city of Bradford in the West Yorkshire part of England, when their father, Patrick Bronte, he was a clergyman, when he was appointed as a priest at St. Michael's and All Angels Church. And he moved in with his wife, Maria, and 6 children. They started living a very simple, quiet, and unassuming life in the parsonage, a church house. But they also lived during tough times. The kids especially, the Bronte kids especially, had a very bleak childhood. After moving to Haworth, Patrick Bronte's wife, Maria, died of cancer, followed by 2 of their elder daughters to typhoid and tuberculosis, life-threatening diseases back then. Patrick Bronte was left with his 4 children, Charlotte, Emily, Anne, and Branwell Bronte. I don't think we can even imagine the kind of tragic losses these people suffered emotionally and physically. And I don't think we can either imagine how would have Mr. Bronte held his family together during those tough times. Poor sanitation continued to worsen the health condition of the Bronte kids, and they were all pulled out of the school and confined to the 4 walls of the home. They had no social life, no merriments. However, the absence of formal education did not deter the Bronte kids at all, for they had access to a diverse range of books. Patrick Bronte had a wonderful collection of books, and he imposed no kind of censorship on the kind of reading the Bronte kids had. Probably the creative genius that was quite evident, that was quite obvious in every Bronte kid, was born at a very young age just because of the exposure, just because of the kind of reading these Bronte kids had. The reading they had was quite wide, extensive, and diverse. Let me quickly take you through an incident that will tell you more about the creative genius that Emily Bronte was from a very young age. When she was only 12 years old, Emily Bronte, along with her sister Anne Bronte, wrote a set of poems called the Gondel Poems. Now, Gondel was a fictional land, an imaginary setup, a land that they created. And what makes it very significant is its geography, the moors which we see in abundance in Wuthering Heights too. Another interesting feature about the Gondal poems was the central character, was the protagonist. The protagonist of this poem was a queen. Her name was Augusta Almeida, who was a very strong, fierce, independent woman, often reminding us of Catherine, the character from Wuthering Heights. Who's quite popular, who's known for the rustic quality that she portrays in the novel. So this kind of tells us how creative and how powerful was that streak of imagination in Emily Bronte from a very young age. At this juncture, I think we should also be grateful to Miss Fanny Ratchford. She was a librarian and a scholar. She was the person who actually found out the Gondal poems and saved it from going into oblivion. So just taking a moment to remember such researchers that we have in the world. Now, without much ado, let's get into the plot of Wuthering Heights. The story of Wuthering Heights revolves around two families, the Earnshaws of Wuthering Heights and the Lintons of the Thrushcross Grange. And the story unravels before us in the form of diary entries, flashbacks, and multiple narratives. So as readers, you should not expect a proper beginning, middle, and end to the story, or that kind of a linear structure to this novel. Probably that is also one reason that makes Wuthering Heights a compelling read. The year is 1801 when the novel begins, and we have a man called Lockwood who rents out this manor house called Thrushcross Grange. And he comes to know that the landlord of Thrushcross Grange lives just 4 miles away from there. He decides to pay him a visit because Lockwood was feeling all lonely and was looking for a companion. He reaches Wuthering Heights, where the landlord Heathcliff was staying. But least did Lockwood knew that Heathcliff was not a man to be meddled with. Heathcliff is not, participating or enjoying any kind of a meeting or a conversation with Lockwood. And Lockwood soon realizes this. But not just that, Lockwood is actually taken aback by the rudeness in behavior exhibited by every other inhabitant at Wuthering Heights. Be it Joseph, the caretaker of Wuthering Heights, who constantly mumbles something under his breath, or a woman whom he saw sitting there and knitting something, whom Lockwood, initially describes as a real goddess. But, she also appears to be extremely rude. Lockwood was quite taken aback by this kind of rudeness exhibited by the inhabitants there. Now, things take a different turn, or things become more interesting in the novel when Lockwood actually is forced to stay at Wuthering Heights that night because of the stormy weather outside. He is shown a room upstairs, and there inside the room he comes across a few diaries. And he reads the name Catherine Earnshaw written on the diary. He reads a few diary entries and falls asleep inside the room. In the sleep, he starts getting nightmares. The next day, Lockwood wakes up alarmed, terrified, disappointed at his experience there at Wuthering Heights, and he decides to get back to Thrushcross Grange as quickly as possible. He reaches there, and Nellie Dean, the housekeeper, awaits him. And Lockwood narrates to her whatever experience he had at Wuthering Heights. And he sits there and tells her how disappointing it was to meet people who were not very welcoming to him. Now Nellie tells him something more. She tells him that the manor house, Wuthering Heights, has a very long history. And she tells him that he must know the story at Wuthering Heights in order to understand what happened to the inhabitants there. At this juncture, I believe the novel, it's a very important point, I would say, in the novel, because a very subtle transition takes place. The narrator moves from Lockwood to Nellie Dean, and this transition is so smooth that the readers organically become all ears to Nellie Dean, and we are all awaiting from her to know what happened at Wuthering Heights so many years ago. And Nellie Dean becomes the narrator from there, trying to tell the readers what happened at Wuthering Heights 30 years ago. And there begins the next part of the story. Nellie was a young maid working at the Wuthering Heights 30 years ago. Mr. Earnshaw, who was the owner of the Wuthering Heights, was a gentleman who once sets off on a trip to Liverpool and on his way back home brings along with him a boy whom he calls Heathcliff. The only information that he shares with the rest of the inhabitants of Wuthering Heights is the fact that this boy is an orphan. That's it. No other whereabouts about the boy is shared. It was quite obvious from day one that Heathcliff was not welcomed by any of the other members of the Wuthering Heights, especially the kids Hindley and Catherine. But what made it worse for the rest of the family was the fact that Mr. Earnshaw had a great liking for Heathcliff. He loved and adored this boy, often neglecting his own kids, Hindley and Catherine. But as life would have it, fate had other plans. Mrs. Earnshaw falls sick and she passes away, leaving Mr. Earnshaw with Hindley and Catherine and a Heathcliff to take care of. And Mr. Earnshaw continues to grow fonder of Heathcliff. He continues to love him a lot. Days of trouble and torment begins for Heathcliff, for Hindley never loses a chance to inflict pain emotionally and physically on Heathcliff. But strange enough, Catherine, on the other hand, who started off disliking Heathcliff to a great extent when he arrived at Wuthering Heights, she begins to take a liking for this boy. Probably because Catherine and Hindley, even the siblings, they did not share any special bond. On the other hand, in Heathcliff, she was able to find a good friend. And vice versa. For Heathcliff, he had no other friends at Wuthering Heights other than Mr. Earnshaw, who was really fond of him, who loved him. So he also became good friends with Catherine. And they started playing together, having fun together, and they spent a lot of time together out there in the moors. Meanwhile, Hindley, who was very much disappointed by his father's actions, who was, disheartened at the thought that he is not much loved by his father, he decides to leave the place. He goes out of the place and he comes back only on Mr. Earnshaw's death a few years later, but now this time as the legitimate heir inheriting Wuthering Heights. He is the owner. Hindley becomes the owner of Wuthering Heights. This time he comes back with his wife. He's a grown-up man. He's married and comes back with his wife, Frances, and takes control of Wuthering Heights. Now he lets Heathcliff stay, but only as a servant. And at this point in the novel, we realize the kind of anger and hatred Hindley was harboring within him in all these years. Despite so many years, he still feels that anger towards Heathcliff for becoming his father's favorite child. He still feels that disappointment towards his father who just neglected his own kids and loved another child a lot more. Probably, Hindley was looking forward to this day. Meanwhile, as though in a parallel world altogether, Heathcliff and Catherine start falling for each other. Heathcliff finds great joy in her companionship and vice versa. I think John Donne's lines would justify the kind of relationship they shared. If I borrow Donne's lines, she was all states and all princess I, nothing else is. I believe Heathcliff and Catherine shared something of this sort. They shared this kind of a relationship. And as readers, even we would wish for the story to end at this point just so that Heathcliff and Catherine would live happily ever after. But life had different plans for them. At this point, Thrushcross Grange and the Lintons at the Thrushcross Grange comes into play. Following a particular instance, Catherine is taken to Thrushcross Grange for a treatment and Heathcliff is left outside. At the Thrushcross Grange, Catherine grows closer to Edgar Linton and Isabella. Edgar Linton being a very gentleman kind of a person, Catherine likes him a lot. Heathcliff, on the other hand, is unaware of what is happening to Catherine. He is not even allowed to go and visit her at Thrushcross Grange. Meanwhile, at Wuthering Heights, Hindley's wife Frances gives birth to their son, Hareton. And so much actually starts happening from this point in the novel. Hindley and Edgar comes together to mock Heathcliff. And Heathcliff is disappointed, disheartened, not knowing and not being able to communicate with Catherine. On the other hand, we see Catherine developing a liking for Edgar Linton. At this point, as readers, I want all of you to take a minute to think about the character of Catherine. The moment we read about her falling or, developing a liking for Edgar Linton, it's quite natural for us to have these questions in our mind like, was that the right thing to do so? Wasn't she madly in love with Heathcliff? What would happen to Heathcliff if she falls for Edgar Linton? Has she thought about it? It's perfectly all right, to feel that slight tremor of anger towards the character of Catherine. But take a minute to think about how Emily Bronte has beautifully portrayed the unfathomable conflicts the human mind is capable of experiencing through the character of Catherine. Miss Bronte is not trying to justify any of the events or any of the acts of the character. Instead, what she's trying to do is to put across whatever it is as real and raw as it is. She's trying to bring out the rustic quality of human emotions and human characters. I'm not surprised to know that the Victorian society must have left out gasps of horror reading a novel like Wuthering Heights. But when everybody around us is trying to box everything into black and white, here we have a woman who had not much of a social life to celebrate, who had no great social circle of friends, a woman writer at that, who's trying to look at and who's trying to understand and make us understand the layers of human life and human emotions. Let's get back to the plot again. A few years later, Heathcliff returns to Wuthering Heights, but this time as a wealthy man. We have no idea where he accumulated the wealth from, but then he's come back very rich. He's also come back as a person who has got nothing to lose. He's got nothing to risk. So he could be a dangerous person. And he was ready to take control. He pretends to fall in love, or he pretends being in love with Isabella Linton just to execute his revenge plan. We have Edgar Linton, who appears to be in a very helpless situation. He's been portrayed as a very gentleman character throughout the novel. So now there is Edgar Linton. On one side, he has a sister, Isabella, who has fallen head over heels for Heathcliff, someone he detests a lot. And on the other hand, he has his wife, Catherine, who is pregnant, who's sick and pregnant, and is also disheartened, disappointed, leading a very depressed life since Heathcliff left Wuthering Heights. When you look at the character of Edgar Linton, you feel you feel sorry for him. We really do. And Heathcliff, on the other hand, is back with he is back here to execute his revenge plan. And he starts off by forcing Hindley to get into gambling. And finally, Heathcliff inherits, he gets Wuthering Heights. He becomes the owner of the Wuthering Heights. Tables are turned now. Isabella realizes that she was being cheated on by Heathcliff, and hence she flees to London, where she gives birth to his child, Linton. Now, at this point in the novel, Heathcliff realizes that Catherine, on the other hand, is dying. She's sick and she is, nearing her death. He goes wild with anger and he becomes almost crazy in doing this. He makes several attempts to meet her, but Edgar makes sure that he never gets to meet Cathy. And Catherine finally gives in. She dies giving birth to her daughter, Cathy. Heathcliff is heartbroken on knowing about Catherine's death. He gets crazier day by day. And he even reaches a point where he wishes for Catherine's ghost to haunt him as long as he's alive. At this point in the novel, I find to be very strange. It's strange for the intensity it shows, and I don't know what to call it. Is it the intensity of the love they shared? Is it sheer madness, or is it being selfish in love? I don't know. I think I would leave it to the reader to decide it. But there is this strange intensity that just clings on to you as we read it. And this is something that stands out in the novel. I think as we read through the novel, at least some of us might justify Heathcliff's actions, thinking he has lost somebody whom he loved the most in his life. So it's quite justifiable. But what makes me think is the fact that Heathcliff has turned into a tormentor who was once a victim. Now he is somebody who enjoys inflicting pain on others, and that's how he seeks, and that's why he seeks revenge. He is, despite being heartbroken, he continues to ruin the younger generation of the Lintons and the Earnshaws. But at the same time, he is losing his mind. But what else does vengeance do to a person, who harbors it for a very long time? That's exactly what happens when we harbor a lot of vengeance and hatred in our minds. At this point in the novel, Nellie stops the tale. Because she was narrating it to Lockwood, at this point she stops the tale and takes a pause. All this while, Lockwood was listening to Nellie, as she was narrating the story that unraveled at Wuthering Heights. He is able to form a perspective on the inhabitants of Wuthering Heights right now, and even feel a certain amount of empathy for these characters. But I believe it would have been really unsettling for him to know about the events that took place at Wuthering Heights, and he decides to leave the place. But he returns after a few months. On his return, he comes to know that Heathcliff went mad completely after a point, and he was hallucinating and was getting visions of Catherine all the time. He even avoided meeting young people just because the young people reminded him of Catherine and himself and all their good old times. And one fine morning, he was found dead in Catherine's room. Whatever was left of Wuthering Heights was being taken care of Joseph, and the Lintons have moved to Thrushcross Grange. And people in the village now circulate stories. A lot of stories are going around where people say that they have seen the ghost of Heathcliff and Catherine roaming around the moors together. And they believe they are in a better place now. They are at peace at this point. I remember feeling a lump in my throat when I finished reading the novel. And I'm pretty sure that any reader, would, when they would finish reading this novel, would feel a heavy heart, and even feel a certain amount of sadness for the characters in this novel. It's quite natural for our mind to ask a lot of questions like, was justice served to these characters? Was Heathcliff being right when he turned into a tormentor even though he was once a victim? Did Edgar deserve all this? Was justice served to the characters here in this novel? But I believe it's very, very difficult to distill such a powerful novel into questions like this. Instead, I would say that this novel is a powerful observation. It's a careful observation, actually, on the capacity of human mind, of human psyche and motives. Because we do things for reasons only known to us. This novel is mostly remembered for the love between, this undeterring, incredible, fantastic love shared by Heathcliff and Catherine. But I'd say that it is also about the other characters who've contributed in ways that are, in many ways to the narrative of the story. By the time we reach the end of the story, we are awestruck, not just by the plot, but at the rubies of the writer. I cannot stop thinking about Emily Bronte. This woman who had no access to social life, who had not many social relationships to boast about, but somebody like that who has written about the most gripping qualities of human psyche with such clarity. That just leaves us in awe. And how I wish she had lived for a few more years to tell us more about her writing craft, her influences and more. But yeah, we definitely have her novel with all of us. And I am pretty sure that this novel is going to haunt generations to come. I hope you have a great time reading Wuthering Heights. Thank you so much for listening.